Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very senior and accomplished professional from Bremen, Germany, Christian Conrad. Christian, welcome to the show.
Very happy to be here, Ashutosh. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Christian is a thought leader in the area of culture, leadership, and engagement. And he's an author, and all of you know I'm always very partial to authors. He's an author of a book which is titled, a name I can't pronounce, but it means magnetic culture. And the name is in German, so maybe I'm going to ask Christian to introduce his book to us, the name of his book. Christian, how would you pronounce this book?
Magnetische Unternehmenskultur, which is magnetic culture, magnetic corporate culture. So
Thank you. I didn't want to attempt to pronounce it because I knew I wouldn't get it right. So, Christian, let me start by asking you a question I'm sure you've been asked many times. Tell me about your journey and what got you interested in the area of culture and leadership.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I mean, my first connection to culture actually happened while I was still at university in Mannheim, Germany, in 1991, and I was studying economics, but I was interested in marketing as well. So I basically walked through the university and saw a poster where you were asked to write an essay on corporate culture. I'd never heard of the term before, but the title of the essay was to be Corporate Culture Marketing Strategy for Corporate Success. So because I was quite good at writing essays and not so good at exams, I decided to do that. And I won an internship at Lufthansa in New York as a result.
Wow.
And that was my entry ticket to my marketing career, which was the next step. And during those 12 years of FMCG marketing at Unilever and Kellogg's, I learned culture from within. So I understood that there are different cultures. Unilever culture was different from the Kellogg culture. And then I actually learned or got to know two very different leadership styles while I was at Kellogg's, which actually resulted in a cultural change. So I experienced culture change from within and as a leader. So that was kind of the second step. And then I was part of the leadership team of Kellogg, Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. I was marketing director at the time, and we had a workshop together, a leadership workshop, and we all gave each other feedback. And out of 10 people, 8 people gave me the feedback: Christian, you can't listen. You're good at talking, but you're a lousy listener. Yeah. And that was sort of a turning point for me, because I said, this cannot stay like this. I need to change that. And not as a result, but it helped that I changed sides, became a consultant, started a consultancy in the area of sustainability, which I ran for 10, 11 years. And during that time, I started, I learned to become a trainer in leadership development. So I became a trainer in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People and some other concepts by Stephen Covey, and did that for quite a while. Also, during that time, I did a culture change project, my first culture change project with a natural history museum in Berlin, which was quite exciting in 2012 to 2014. And in 2015, I decided to focus completely on leadership training, coaching, team development, organizational development, and wrote my book in 2019.
Wow.
And since then, it's been my absolute focus to
Fascinating.
So I come from the practical side of things. I've learned, I've seen culture from different sides in my career.
Wonderful. So how would you define, Christian, a magnetic corporate culture?
I would say that it's a culture that people enjoy staying with because they're fully satisfied with the experience they get. So, and the kind of asset test is whether it is actually magnetic, is whether people are willing to recommend the company as an employer to others.
Right.
Because that will mean that they're not just satisfied, but they're fully satisfied and highly emotionally engaged with the company they're with. They like going to work. You will feel that there is a good atmosphere of high energy in the company, and that results in turn in low turnover, low absenteeism, more applications than open positions, high performance, innovation. You know, that is actually what makes the company magnetic. It's an exciting place to be.
Yeah. And, you know, you just very briefly spoke about Kellogg and how you witnessed culture transition from inside. For my viewers and listeners, Christian, can you share an example of a company that successfully transformed its culture following your program?
Yeah, I've got a client in mind. I wouldn't say that they fully transformed it, but they actually made a measurable difference. I would say that their culture wasn't bad to begin with, you know. But we've been running a program that I call Engagement Booster Program with them for 2 years, and we measure success by measuring the employee net promoter score.
Right.
And this company has grown its net promoter score from 6 to 40 within an 18-month period. So that's the big transformation in terms of exactly that kind of feeling, you know, that kind of feeling of connectedness, the feeling of engagement. It's an exciting company. They're stock listed, really a high performance company with a 15% compound growth rate, per annum growth rate. So, you know, they actually do have very, very high expectations of whoever they employ, and people who actually are employed there can really grow. So they really need, in order to maintain their growth pace, they really need highly qualified, highly productive, highly engaged people. So that's why it made sense for them to run this program.
Very interesting. Very interesting. And yet, when you work with multinationals, which are working in incredibly culturally diverse countries, how do cultural differences impact the adoption of a magnetic culture?
I think you need to really be sensitive to those culture differences. I mean, my program focuses on behavioral change, and you need to, when you talk about behavioral change, you really need to look at different cultures, because the behaviors will have a different impact in different cultures. So you cannot just run a program like that and not really look at different cultures. Let's give one example from this company. It's a German company, but it's international. So we have French, British, Portuguese, and North American subsidiaries. And the biggest culture difference actually we had, or we kind of witnessed, with the North American team. One of the behaviors is I call positive reinforcement. And the interesting thing is that in North America, positive reinforcement is a much more everyday thing than in Europe. You give each other a lot more. You say, okay, well done. You know, Americans and Canadians, they grow up with a completely different level of personal appreciation. So doing that is actually not as effective in North America, because the level is much higher. Yeah. Which you can also see in, you probably know the Gallup Engagement Index.
Yeah.
The percentage of highly engaged employees, according to Gallup, in Europe is about 13%. In North America is about 30%, 30 plus. So it's twice as high, which I would say it's a hypothesis. It's not measured, it's not proven. Has to do with this kind of level of general appreciation and positivity, in the workplace. Because in society there's a higher level. So that's an example of how cultural differences actually do make a huge difference in how you then sort of apply different measures and how you apply it, how you run a program.
Very interesting. You also in your book, talk a little bit about the magnetic culture. So my question is, what is the most important step a company can take to begin its journey towards a more engaging culture?
I think the most important step, or the first step, is to take stock. You need to measure the status quo. If you don't do that, you can't really manage it. Otherwise it stays a fluffy, soft concept if you don't put some figures and measures to it. So if you measure it, and there are various ways of measuring. We mentioned Gallup, we mentioned Net Promoter Score. That there's different tools, and whatever tool you choose will give you a starting point, and then you can actually measure progress from there.
Right.
So I think that's the number one. That's the starting point that you need to treat it as any other business challenge, where you would always like to have some figures and measures to actually chart your progress.
And given the work that you do with so many clients, in what ways can a company integrate their own values into their daily operations to reinforce their culture?
That's a really, I like that question, because a lot of companies develop values. They're highbrow, sound very good. I think a key thing you need to do is you need to break down the values into what I would call or what I would call guiding behaviors. So if you don't make the tradition into behaviors that actually bring those values to life, the values will remain academic, posters on the wall. So that's the thing that you need to do. You need to really ask yourself, and maybe develop it within the organization. Our values are this and that. What kind of behaviors actually brings those values to life?
Well said. So one more question related to culture, then I want to move to leadership. What, in your view, are some of the common obstacles companies face in creating a magnetic culture, and how can they overcome them?
Okay, so I'll give you four that I've encountered. The first one is that that they see culture as a soft concept, while it actually is a hard concept. It's like saying trust is it's something soft, while it's actually commercially very hard. So what I mean by that is you need to really put some commercial link to your commercial performance and success to culture. And that's very easy. I would say that any company of a decent size has the potential of 7-8 figure cost savings and growth if they actually move from an average to a magnetic high performing culture. Obstacle 2 is that they don't measure. They don't measure it, so it stays a fluffy concept. Obstacle 3 is focus on just implementing measures, stroke of the pen decisions, rather than behavioral change. And obstacle 4 is that they're too impatient, too short a time horizon. That kind of change takes time. And in my book, I share an example of Mars. Everybody knows Mars, is a big company, and they measured engagement like 10, 12 years ago, 15 years ago, I think it was in the German or German speaking markets. And they were surprised, they worked with Gallup, surprised that they were much much less advanced than they expected. And they say, okay, we take 3 years and we'll change and get to where we wanted to be. In the end, it took 8 years.
Wow.
But they got there. You know, they're stuck with it. So they realized 3 years is too short, but they stuck with it, and they got where they wanted to go, which was a huge shift.
Amazing. So let's now move to a few questions for you on leadership. And of course, I will keep relating it back to culture. How do you see the relationship between leadership and corporate culture?
I would say it's a very strong relationship. I think that the leadership culture that you have determines your corporate culture. So I think leadership is key, and any culture change needs to happen top down. You cannot. Sometimes leaders feel that they can delegate. You know, say, okay, let's create a working group that works out our desired corporate culture. I think you can't do that. I think you need to be involved. If you're an executive, if you're a CEO, if you're a COO, you need to be involved in shaping the culture. And your behavior actually makes a huge difference.
Right.
Huge difference.
Right. Lead by example, as they say the culture is in several companies. But the other question, the other question that I have, Christian, for you is that what are the qualities of a leader who can effectively foster a magnetic culture?
Yeah, I developed a model for that.
Okay.
So there are 4 qualities, and the first one is actually to know his or her why. You know, have a clear purpose.
Yeah.
So that's the starting point. People can see that, and it's very attractive to follow, to be led by people who actually do have a strong purpose. Second one is likes people. You need to like people if you're leading people. If you're leading organizations, you can't just like processes. You need to like people. You need to be relational, easy to connect with, able to connect. So that's the who. You know, if you like to say, you need to have a strong why. You have to have a strong who. Third one is high energy and being a skilled communicator. So in terms of being able to listen, being able to speak, and that's the how. That's the how you conduct your business. And the fourth one is focused, clear, driven, with a fierce resolve. You could kind of make it even shorter. Jim Collins, level 5 leaders are those leaders that foster magnetic cultures, and they share 2 traits: fierce resolve and humility. Yeah.
Well said. The other factor that is there, and again, I'm going to use an old, much used line, which is when the going gets tough, the tough get going. What advice do you have for leaders trying to maintain a strong company culture during times of crisis?
I think the first thing that they need to do is they need to listen well, so people feel they're understood, and communicate clearly and concisely. And the second thing they need to do is they need to acknowledge that in crisis, the biggest need is for safety and feeling secure. So they need to give people the feeling that they are safe. You know, even in the face of reorganization, restructuring, you have to let people go. You need to make sure that the people who remain feel safe, and that's a big challenge. But that's a basic psychological need that people have, and you need to make sure that is actually met. Otherwise, the culture can crumble.
Great response. So, Christian, I have time for 2 more questions for you. My next question is that given today's work environment where hybrid work or work from home is becoming quite normal, leadership has its own set of challenges. What strategies do you recommend for developing leadership skills in a remote or a hybrid work environment?
I think that it is even more important to communicate.
Mm-hmm.
So what I mean by that is, because you don't see each other so much, there is a lack of informal communication, and you need to kind of compensate for that lack of informal communication so that people feel they still belong and engaged. That means, as a leader, you need to communicate more, not less. And in particular, you need to listen, and you need to communicate on different levels. So you need to communicate with your direct reports on a one-on-one more often than you might if you share an office.
Right.
And you need to communicate more on a sort of team or organization level, town halls, all hands meetings, that sort of thing needs to happen rather more frequently than less. So because there is a lack of, you need to compensate for the lack of informal communication, and need to make sure that people really feel that they belong. And that's something that we've seen in the pandemic, that in the first year that was all okay, but after 2 years, this kind of belonging actually started to go back, and people felt isolated. They didn't feel they really belonged. And then you have all the new people coming in that you need to try to get into the fold, and they didn't have that feeling of connection before. So you need to do something about that. And I think actually, and that's why you say of the hybrid work environment, what really helps is to have events where people meet in person when they work remote. I've seen that now in many companies, that when they actually invest in having people, bring people in from all over the world to meet in person for just 2 days, that has such a huge impact on the work they're doing when they leave again. So I think I hope that answers your question. I think communication is probably a real core.
Correct. What you're really saying is over communicate in times of hybrid and remote working. Thank you. My last question to you, Christian, and this is based on what I was, when I was preparing to read about you, I was fascinated with your vision, where your vision is to make 1 million more smiling people in the workplace. How do you incorporate your vision into your leadership coaching?
Yeah, I come back to the point that I made about measuring. If you say something like that, you need to be willing to kind of measure it as well. For me, I use a net promoter score system. So every person that moves from being a detractor or passive in the net promoter score world and moves into becoming a promoter, I use one who answers to the question, how likely are you to recommend your workplace to others on a 10-point scale, and they give a 9 or a 10. So everyone who's a 9 or a 10 and came from lower than that is actually an added smiling person, because they are fully satisfied. So they will probably be happy, be prepared to share their enthusiasm with others. And that is actually how I incorporated it into my daily coaching and work, is that I do run, I'm building a platform for online surveys in companies. And that's actually the very tangible way that is linked to my vision.
Absolutely. So Christian, on that note, thank you so much for speaking to me about your journey. It's been so fascinating, from the corporate world to culture and leadership and magnetic culture. Thank you for speaking to me at such length about culture, about magnetic culture. Thank you for speaking to me about leadership, and also your vision of making 1 million more smiling people in the corporate world. Thank you again for speaking to me, and good luck.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Ashutosh. It was very, very, very good questions, and lovely to have that.
Thank you for listening to the brand called You Videocast and Podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the brand called You.